Yeah, good morning. It's a privilege to come here again and have the honor to preach to you again. I'll be reading, our text today is Genesis 28, verse 10 to 22. Let's first read. I will not read all the text, but let's start from verse 10. So, Genesis 28, starting from verse 10. I'm reading from the ESV version. So Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you. And let's move on to verse 17. So verse 17, and he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Verse 19, he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I'll give a full tenth to you. Let's start with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you that you can speak to us through your word, and you can use a weak vessel like me. I pray that you will talk and you will convey your message this morning to your ministers and to your future pastors, and just open the hearts of, my mouth to convey the message to them. In Jesus' name, amen. So our text here starts in verse 11, and I just want to give you a background about the narrative. We all know, we are all familiar with this story or this narrative. So the famous tension between Jacob and Esau, they have this, fight over the birthright, and Jacob, we know the stories that Jacob followed the counsel of his mother, and he stole the birthright from his older brother Esau. So as we read in the previous chapter, Esau was very angry from his brother, and he began to hate him, and he wanted to kill him. He planned to kill him, and he just, he said to himself, well, I will just wait till my father dies, and then I'll kill my brother Jacob. So, fortunately, his mother heard that, and she made her plans and arranged everything that Jacob should, flee to Padan Aram. So we read in chapter 28, in the beginning of the chapter. So he went to his father Isaac, and he blessed him, and then sent him to Padan Aram in order to take a wife, not from the wife from Canaan, but go to Padan Aram to take a wife from there. But, the real reason for his flight to there was not that he would just take a wife, but in order to flee from his own brother, he wanted, to kill him. So our narrative here in verse 10 actually starts with a crisis. So Jacob was, alone, away from his home, and he was just going, in this bleak moorland, walking in this land alone. He was pursuing the promise. He was pursuing the blessing, but now it seems like he's losing it. He's losing everything. he's away from the land, he's away from the cattle, he's away from every heritage that he could get. And he's just, fleeing from his own brother and, fleeing for his life. So he was really in crisis. And as we read verse 10 and 11, it seems like he was not even, riding anything. Like there was no camel that he ride or anything. And if we read in chapter 32 and verse 10, I believe. Yeah, and verse 10, for with only my staff I crossed Jordan and now have become 2 camels. So he was just, walking there on his own. I mean, nothing was him. And as we come to verse 12, and he dreamed, so he slept in this, bleak moorland place, very remote place, alone, in crisis, and then he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on earth, and the top it reached to heaven. So this ladder, and we know, we are familiar with what he saw. He saw a ladder, and the angels of God were ascending and descending, and he saw the Lord himself, and the Lord began to speak to him. So in the midst of this, crisis, in the midst of this hard time, the Lord began to reach out to Jacob. So Jacob was in crisis, and the Lord reached out to him in his crisis in order to, manifest himself, reveal himself to Jacob. So actually Jacob, before this time, just know about God. He just know, from his parents, from Isaac and from Rebekah, about their God. But he had no, encounter and no personal relationship with, the Lord. But now, in this time of crisis, it was like as if it's the opportunity of God to reach to someone like Jacob, only in this time of crisis when it seems like he's losing everything, he's losing it, nothing with him, and it seems like, this is the only time that, this is the opportunity that the Lord can reach out and extend his blessing and reveal himself to someone like Jacob. It was different than, for example, the account of Abraham. So Abraham was more, if we read about, the narrative of Abraham, he's more decent. He's not sneaky like Jacob. He's not doing these deceptions in order to, to have the promise. So, the Lord revealed to him, and it was not in a real, crisis. But for Jacob, he had to feel the need to God. He had to be in this crisis in order to God to reach to him. And I don't know about your testimony, but I'll just share my testimony. I was a guy who was very, living a worldly life. I was in college. I had friends, and my life seems to be very, going very well and everything all right. And I was studying college. I have, 2 friends who were, very close to me, and I didn't feel the need for God. Okay, so I had all this kind of, good stuff, and I didn't even go to church except in funerals and weddings and this stuff. But while I was in college, my 2 best friends just break up with me. They just till now I don't know the reason, but they just left me alone, and they just went away, and I lost all my friends, and it was a time of crisis for me. My grades began to be lower, and I was really distressed. And in this time, God reached out to me. And I believe that, it was not like I have to lose something. I have to be in crisis. For me, I have to be in crisis in order to the Lord to just show me that I need him. And he showed me that I need him. So, in times of crisis, God reached out to us. But I'm just not trying to impose my testimony on you. Whatever your testimony, whatever your encounter with God, what I want to tell you, what I believe the Lord is trying to tell you this morning is that just remember this time, because it's so important. That the first time that you met with the Lord, the first time that you make the Lord your God. Okay, so let's go back to our text. So our text in Hebrew, so the Hebrew goes, as we studied about the narrative, the Hebrew goes with, the viactol, the verbs. So the structure was a verb start. Every clause starts with a verb, but we have here we have interruptions on our text. So the normal, main line of the narrative starts with this structure: verb, subject, object. But we have this interruptions at the verse, and these interruptions are mainly marked with the word "behold." So we have two beholds: the word "behold" or the word "hani." The first one in verse 12. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder. And whenever you find this word "behold," especially in verses 13 and verses 15, it's just toward the close. This word just call our attention to what follows it. So it's just emphasizing what following the word itself. So in the first one, in verse 12, behold, there was a ladder. So it just, as if the narrator wants us to pay attention to this scene, the ladder. And the second one, is in the same verse. It's pointing our attention, it's pointing our attention to the angels of God, the angel ascending and descending. And the third, behold, in verse 13, and behold, the Lord. So it's pointing us to the Lord Yahweh. And in verse 15, behold, I am with you, and I'll keep you wherever you go. So these are the four beholds. The first one of them, it comes up after the verb dream, but the other three just starting the close, and they just call our attention to what follows them. Okay, so the first thing, I'll talk about the first one. So the first one is the ladder. So why it's calling our attention to this ladder? There are a lot of I've read a lot of commentaries about that. Some of them will even connect, this ladder that have the angels come ascending and descending to, the Tower of Babel, and because, in verse 17 we read that Jacob named this place Bethel, and we have, from archaeology, we know that the ancient people of Mesopotamia just called their city Babylon, the gate of heaven. So some of, the commentaries make this connection between Babel and between Bethel, but not in similarity, but in contrast. So how is that? So Babel was what? Was man trying to reach God, and he, in his pride and his rebellion, he wanted to. If we go back to Genesis 11, they were trying to make name for themselves. They were trying to avoid being scattered around, the whole earth. But here, we find Jacob himself. Jacob was, he was confused. He was alone. He was in crisis. But then the heaven reached out to him, and the Lord reached out to him from heaven, and he turned this confusion, this, scattering, this, crisis into a revelation, into clarity. And as we go to verse 13, and behold, so the third behold, I'll move from, so the first two beholds are, the ladder and the angels ascending and descending. So the third behold, the Lord stood above it. So it's not only the angels, it's not only a connection between heaven and earth, but most importantly, it's the Lord himself speaking to him. It's the Lord himself revealing himself to him. And not only that this text is connected to Babel, but more importantly, it connected to two other things, two other texts. So the first one is also in the context of the book of Genesis. It's in Genesis 13. But let's read verse 14, because this will make sense if we read verse 14 before we go to So your offspring, so I'm reading verse 14 in the same chapter, chapter 28. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, to the south. And in you, in your offspring, shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Okay? If we go back to Genesis 13, to Abraham. And Abraham in this situation was in crisis too, because Lot have left him. So in chapter 13, verse 14. So Genesis 13, verse 14. The Lord said to Abraham after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, I'll give it to you, and your offspring, and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can count that. So it seems like, there's a connection between those texts. And if you go back also to chapter 28 and 27, and you read the blessing that Isaac was, bestowing on his son Jacob, you will find it very generalized. No specific thing about the land, or your offspring will be as the dust of the earth. But it seems like here, the Lord is reminding him of Abraham. Another thing to confirm that, assertion, look also how the Lord, addressed Jacob. So, in verse 13, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father. Okay, and then he mentioned Isaac, and the God of Isaac. So it seems like the Lord trying to remind him, the same promise that I gave to your decent grandfather Abraham that you heard of, I'm specifically giving it to you. It's not only a general blessing that you heard from your father Isaac, who seemed to be reluctant to give you the blessing, and he seemed to prefer Esau. But I'm giving you the blessing of your decent grandfather Abraham, the same blessing to you, Jacob. And we all know who is Jacob. I mean, we all know. We can speak a long time about how he is not he's a deceitful person. He's not honest. And I don't know if this speaks to you, but it speaks to me. I mean, I'm glad that God, bestowed the same blessing he bestowed on Abraham, on Jacob. Because I'm no better than Jacob. I mean, I know myself. I know my nature. And I believe, if this speaks to me, it speaks to some of you at least. I don't know about all of you, but at least some of you will identify with Jacob somehow. I mean, this is our nature. We're not all the time, decent and perfect. So I'm glad that the Lord here was very specific and very clear. The same promise of Abraham will be given to Jacob. And again, we allude. So I mentioned one text. It's Genesis 13. So there is another more important text for us as Christians that was alluding to this ladder that having the angel ascending and descending. It's the New Testament. So let's go to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 1. So in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, Jesus, we know the story. Jesus was speaking to Nathanael. And Nathanael was surprised that Jesus knew things about him. So in verse 49, Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus answered him in verse 50, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. Do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And in verse 51, and he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So our real ladder, ladder that connects us to heaven is not just, a vision that Jacob saw, but for us as Christians, when we read this, our real, our real person that connects us to the Father is Jesus Christ. So whatever you received from the Father, you received it through Jesus. And whatever you will receive from the Father, you will receive through Jesus Christ. So as we read this, I'll urge you again, recall the first time that you encountered Jesus. Recall the first time that you had the presence of Jesus in your life. Recall the first time that you put your faith in Jesus Christ and your life changed. And whether this was a crisis or whether it was a very joyful time and everything was fine, remember it, because in hard times, this is the thing that you go to and remember. I don't know if you are in crisis now or not. If you are not in crisis, probably you are going to a crisis or coming out of a crisis. So you're not through a crisis, you're going. So this is life. We all have our moments and our hard times. And I believe the message this morning is just remember your Bethel. Remember the time that you encountered me. Remember your Bethel. Well, let's go back to our text again. I'm going to other texts, but so in verse 15, behold, I am with you, I'll keep you wherever you go, and I'll bring you back to this land. So here the promise of God again. He is promising to bring him back to the land, bring him back to the promise. And Jacob actually was worried to get back to the land. If we read his response, so in verse 21, so that I come again to my father's house in peace. So he wants to get back. He wants to get back. So the Lord cares about his need. Okay, and it's very easy, to read about Jacob and just begin to throw stones and criticize him. But I want you to this morning to just take a new perspective and just know that he was, Jacob, a deceitful person, and he just came to encounter the living God. So when you read his vow and say, well, this is childish, he's just, putting conditions. If you feed me, if you bring me back to the land, I'll serve you. But don't just, remember he's a child. And remember yourself when you first knew Christ, probably you didn't understand everything. You just came and you put your face, and it was not very clear. But don't start, criticizing him. Just understand what he's coming from. Also, it's very interesting that, he pledged to serve the Lord, and he pledged to pay, the tithes to the Lord. And one thing that will help us not to, criticize him. That I don't know about you, but I'm not all the time faithful with my, tithes. So. If he's, faithful with his tithes, there is actually statistics, 2008, that just find out that, evangelical Christians, 24% of evangelical Christians are paying tithes. For other denominations, it's only 5%. So we are not that, faithful. We are not, very, much better than Jacob. So let's move on. So what Jacob have here is a dream, but not only a dream. So if you go to verse 13, behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God. So there's one important aspect here, that is the vision itself is not, enough. It was important that the Lord will declare his word to him. Without the word, we really will interpret things in different ways, different than what intended by God. So as minister of God, I urge you not only to remember your Bethel, but remember what is the position of the Word of God in your life and your ministry. It's not enough to have, the experience of Bethel. It's not enough to have, this testimony or these ministries that you went through, or this experience in ministry, or experiences with the Lord. Come back to the Word. Come back to the Word. The Word of God is really your compass. It's really the thing that will keep you from heresy. So it's not only the vision, but also the Word of God. Finally, I'll urge you again to remember your Beth El. Remember the first time you came to the Lord. But remember the Beth El when the Lord called you to ministry. Because this is important. All of us are called somehow to ministry. And there was a time in your life that you can identify that the Lord really called you to minister to Him, to come to the seminary, to study His Word, and to be prepared to do the work of ministry. And whenever you are in seminary, you have hard times. I mean, you have papers, you have exams, and it's really challenging, and it's very easy to just give up. But I urge you, just come back to this Beth El, when the Lord called you to ministry, when the Lord just put you in this race, so that you can continue well and finish well. Okay, so remember your second Beth El, your call to ministry, when the Lord called you to serve Him. So 2 Beth Els, just remember them. They will help you every time you're in crisis, every time you are just don't know what to do. Come back to your Beth El. Come back to your moments. I want to close with a verse from the New Testament, from the book of Revelation. We are all familiar with this in chapter 2, Revelation. But the Lord is speaking to the angel of the church in Ephesus. So in chapter 2 and verse 4, "But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember therefore from where you have fallen. Repent and do the works that you did at first." Amen. Thank you.